The White House was never quiet. Even after her husband's death, the grand old residence seemed to hum with memories, footsteps echoing in marble corridors, laughter drifting from the rose garden, the scratch of pens signing bills into law. Now, as Margaret Ellison, the widow of President Charles Ellison, walked through its empty rooms, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. It had been 6 months since the funeral, 6 months since the solemn march through Washington streets, 6 months since she stood with her black veil pulled low while the nation watched her grieve. And still, the grief clung to her like a second skin. The First Lady who was no more. The newspapers still called her the First Lady. Old habits died hard. Though the Constitution recognized no such title after a president's death, the public could not separate her from it. For them, she was still America's widow, the symbol of grace and loss. Margaret had once worn that image like armor. During Charles's presidency, she had been admired for her poise, her elegant fashion, her carefully measured words. She had smiled through dinners, played hostess to kings and queens, comforted grieving mothers, and kissed babies on campaign trails. But without Charles, the role felt hollow. She was still only 44, yet the world seemed to expect her to live as if already entombed, dignified, untouchable, frozen in memory. Everywhere she went, people lowered their voices, bowed their heads, offered condolences she no longer wanted to hear. They didn't see Margaret, the woman. They saw only the president's widow. Loneliness in the spotlight. Her home in Georgetown was filled with flowers that kept arriving, notes of sympathy stacked in silver trays, books about grief sent by strangers who thought they understood her pain. But when the crowds dispersed, when the cameras turned away, Margaret sat alone by her window, staring at the flickering streetlights. The silence pressed in. Her children were grown. Her days were carefully orchestrated by aides who still hovered, though she had told them they were no longer needed. She attended charity events, ribbon cuttings, memorials, but each felt like a performance she no longer had the strength to give. Most nights, she drank tea until it went cold, reread letters Charles had written during his campaigns, and tried to imagine what life could look like when the rest of the world had already written her story for her. The weight of a legacy. Charles Ellison had been a complicated man. To the nation he was a hero, a war veteran, a strong leader who had stood firm in the face of crisis. To Margaret, he had been both her partner and her burden. She had loved him, yes. But she had also endured him. His ambition consumed everything, leaving little space for her own desires. She had smiled through betrayals, political and personal alike. She had protected him when scandals threatened. She had carried his image like a crown and a cross. Now that crown still sat heavy on her head, though the man who placed it there was gone. A world of expectations. The nation adored her as a symbol of dignity. Magazine covers praised her beauty and resilience. Political allies urged her to remain visible, to preserve Charles's legacy. Invitations flooded in, charity boards, speaking engagements, memoir opportunities. But Margaret no longer wanted to be a symbol. She longed desperately to be a woman again, a woman who could laugh too loudly, who could love recklessly, who could exist without every move scrutinized by history's watchful eye. And yet, she knew that stepping out of line, even once, would destroy the fragile image the country clung to. The first crack. It was on a rainy evening in April when the first crack appeared. Margaret had attended a university lecture honoring her husband's leadership during the Cold War. She sat through the speeches politely, smiling when appropriate, nodding at phrases she had heard 1,000 times before. And then, during the Q&A session, a young journalist stood up. He was tall, dark-haired, his eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that cut through pretense. His name, Margaret would learn later, was Daniel Pierce. His question sliced the air like a blade. Mrs. Ellison, with respect, how do you reconcile the narrative of President Ellison as a man of peace with the escalating conflicts overseas during his administration? Wasn't much of his legacy built on half-truths? The audience gasped. The moderator shifted uncomfortably. Margaret felt the weight of 1,000 eyes turned to her. She should have bristled. She should have shut him down with the practiced grace of a first lady. Instead, she looked into Daniel Pierce's steady gaze and to her own surprise felt alive. A spark in the darkness. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She replayed the moment in her mind, the sharpness of his words, the confidence in his tone, the way he had not bowed to the myth of Charles Ellison as everyone else did. She hated him for it. She admired him for it. And deep down, She felt something stir inside her that she had not felt in years, a spark. The spark of being challenged. The spark of being seen not as a symbol, but as a woman who could still think, feel, and respond. Margaret Ellison, the president's widow, was about to step into a story that would scandalize the nation. But for now, she sat in the dark, her teacup cold in her hands, and whispered to herself words no one else would hear. "I am not finished yet." Daniel Pierce had never wanted to be popular. What he wanted was to be heard. At 31, he was already known in Washington and New York circles as one of the most fearless political journalists of his generation. While others courted favors from politicians, Daniel burned bridges with the stroke of his pen. His articles for the Sentinel were sharp, biting, often merciless. And President Charles Ellison had been one of his favorite targets. The rebel journalist. Daniel came from modest beginnings. He was the son of a schoolteacher and a factory worker, raised in Pittsburgh with more books than money. He had clawed his way to an Ivy League education, and from there into journalism, where his words quickly gained attention. He wasn't content to report facts. He dissected them, questioned them, twisted them into essays that made people uncomfortable. To Daniel, truth was never simple, and power was never pure. President Ellison's administration, in his eyes, had been full of contradictions, speeches about peace paired with escalating military actions abroad, promises of transparency shadowed by secrecy. Daniel wrote it all, publishing editorials that made allies furious and enemies cautious. It earned him admirers among the young and restless. It earned him enemies among the powerful. And it earned him one particular reputation, the journalist who dared to challenge the president. The question that changed everything. When Daniel stood at that university lecture and asked Margaret Ellison his pointed question, he hadn't expected much. Perhaps a polished non-answer, perhaps an annoyed silence. He had not expected her eyes to meet his with such force. In that brief exchange, something had passed between them, something neither of them fully understood. To the crowd, it was just a sharp question. To Daniel, it was the first time he wondered if she had felt trapped by her husband's image too. Daniel's private thoughts. That night, Daniel sat in his cramped D.C. apartment, surrounded by piles of newspapers and half-empty coffee cups. He wrote notes furiously, trying to capture what he had seen in her expression. Margaret Ellison was not just the nation's grieving widow. She was intelligent, sharp, and behind her composed exterior, he thought he glimpsed something else, something restless, maybe even rebellious. He cursed himself for thinking about her at all. It was dangerous, absurd. She was 20 years older than him, the most watched widow in America, and the embodiment of everything his career had fought against. And yet, he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes. An invitation. The following week, Daniel received an envelope. Thick, cream-colored, embossed with the seal of the Ellison Foundation. Inside was a handwritten note. Mr. Pierce, I would like to extend an invitation to the upcoming charity gala hosted in honor of the Ellison Children's Fund. I believe even critics deserve to see the causes they so often write about. Respectfully, Margaret Ellison. Daniel stared at the note for a long time. It was unexpected, bold, dangerous, and it was impossible to resist. The gala night. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble. Washington's elite gathered in gowns and tuxedos, raising champagne glasses in Charles Ellison's memory. Daniel, uncomfortable in his rented suit, stood near the edge of the crowd, notebook tucked discreetly in his pocket. He told himself he was there to observe, to report. But when Margaret entered the room, his resolve faltered. She was radiant in a black gown, her hair swept into an elegant chignon, diamonds at her ears catching the light. But it wasn't just her beauty, it was her poise, the way she carried herself as if the whispers of the crowd were nothing more than wind. When their eyes met across the room, it was not the gaze of a politician's widow and a journalist's critic. It was recognition. A spark. A dangerous dance. Later, as the music swelled and guests filled the dance floor, Margaret approached him. Mr. Pierce, she said, her voice calm but edged with amusement. I hope you're finding something worth writing about tonight. Daniel's lips curved into a smile. That depends, Mrs. Ellison. Will you give me something worth writing? Her eyes narrowed, but her lips twitched with the hint of a smile. It was a dangerous dance, each word a step closer to something they both knew could not, should not happen. And yet, when Margaret offered her hand, Daniel took it. Not as a journalist. Not as a critic. But as a man drawn into a story he could not control. The line begins to blur. That night, Margaret found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. Daniel's wit was quick, his mind sharp, his refusal to worship her husband's memory oddly refreshing. And Daniel found himself disarmed. He had expected a polished symbol, but he found a woman of intelligence, warmth, and fire. When he left the gala, the city's spring rain falling around him, Daniel knew he should forget her. Write his story, file his column, move on. But as he closed his umbrella and shoved his hands into his pockets, he whispered to himself words he never thought he'd say about Margaret Ellison. She's worth the risk. Washington in spring had a way of softening even the hardest of hearts. The cherry blossoms lined the tidal basin, their petals drifting through the air like pink snowflakes, covering sidewalks and statues alike. For Margaret Ellison, however, the beauty felt hollow. She had grown accustomed to living as a symbol. Every step outside her Georgetown townhouse was watched, photographed, analyzed. If she wore black, the papers said she was still cloaked in grief. If she smiled at a luncheon, headlines speculated she was moving on too quickly. There was no space to simply be Margaret. She was always the president's widow. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with her story. The library event. It was at the Jefferson Library, during a panel discussion on presidential legacies, that Margaret saw him again. Daniel Pierce. She had tried not to think of him since the gala, though the memory lingered. The quick wit. The way he had made her laugh without effort. The way he had looked at her, not as a relic of a dead president, but as a woman. Now, as she entered the grand reading room with its domed ceiling and rows of scholars, she spotted him at once. He was seated in the audience, a pen in hand, scribbling notes. His eyes lifted and found hers, and for a moment, the crowd disappeared. She looked away too quickly, her pulse betraying her. The debate sparks. The panel was dry, professors reciting well-worn assessments of Charles Ellison's presidency. Margaret sat at the table, smiling politely, offering practiced remarks. Then Daniel stood to ask a question. Mrs. Ellison, he began, his voice steady, historians often portray your husband as a figure of unity, a man who bridged divides. But privately, his gaze swept the room, daring anyone to interrupt. He was known to be ruthless with opponents. Do you believe the legend overshadows the man? Gasps echoed softly through the room. Again, Daniel had cut to the bone. Margaret should have deflected. That was what a first lady, or former first lady, was trained to do. Instead, something inside her stirred. She leaned toward the microphone. Perhaps, Mr. Pierce, she said evenly, you mistake ruthlessness for conviction. History may soften his edges, but every man is a mixture of contradictions. Even presidents. The audience chuckled nervously. Daniel's lips quirked into the faintest smile. For a flicker of a second, it felt as if they were the only two people in the room, sparring across invisible lines. After the panel. When the event ended, Margaret intended to slip away quietly. She had fulfilled her duty. She was tired. But as she exited into the marble hallway, she heard footsteps behind her. Mrs. Ellison, Daniel's voice called. She turned, her heart betraying her calm expression. Mr. Pierce. I should have expected you'd be here, waiting with more questions. His smile was quick, disarming. Only one. Would you join me for coffee? Off the record. The request was audacious. A widow of a president and the journalist who had sharpened his career by criticizing that very president? It bordered on scandal even to be seen together. And yet, to her own surprise, Margaret found herself nodding. The coffee house. They met at a small cafe tucked on a quiet corner near DuPont Circle. The kind of place where students and poets gathered, not senators and widows. Margaret wore a silk scarf and dark glasses, but she knew some would still recognize her. Daniel ordered black coffee. Margaret chose tea. At first, their conversation was formal, careful. Politics, charity work, his writing, her foundation. But slowly, the formality dissolved. Daniel's words were sharp, yes, but his eyes softened when she spoke. He listened. Truly listened. You're different than I imagined, he admitted finally. And how did you imagine me? She asked, arching a brow. He smirked. Cold. Controlled. A woman carved from marble to match her husband's monument. She laughed, an honest laugh that startled even herself. And now, he said quietly, I see a woman who's been carrying the weight of a country for too long. Her breath caught. No one had ever dared say it aloud. A dangerous pull. They talked until the sky outside turned from afternoon blue to dusk. Margaret forgot the time, forgot the world outside, forgot the image she was supposed to maintain. For a few precious hours, she was not the president's widow. She was simply Margaret, a woman with sharp opinions, with laughter in her voice, with loneliness she dared to reveal. When they finally stood to leave, Daniel walked her to her car. The spring air was cool, the city alive with headlights and horns. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For reminding me that I'm still alive. Their eyes locked, the silence between them electric. Neither moved closer, but the possibility hung there, dangerous, undeniable. Whispers begin. By the next morning, whispers had already started. A staffer had seen them at the cafe. Another had noticed how long they had spoken after the panel. Nothing concrete. Nothing provable. But enough to make allies uneasy. For Margaret and Daniel, the world still saw only glimmers. But the spark had been lit. And sparks, left unchecked, always find a way to burn. Secrecy has its own kind of intoxication. For Margaret Ellison, the first few meetings with Daniel Pierce carried the thrill of walking a tightrope. One misstep, and the fall could be catastrophic. Yet with each step she took, she felt more alive than she had in years. They began innocently enough. A coffee after a lecture. A shared cab when the rain fell. Letters disguised as correspondence about the Ellison Foundation, folded neatly into cream-colored envelopes. But words are dangerous things. And theirs began to slip from guarded civility into something else, something fragile, intimate, and forbidden. Letters at midnight. It was Daniel who first wrote to her in the hours past midnight. Mrs. Ellison. You once told me every man is a mixture of contradictions. I wonder, do you believe the same is true of women? Or does the world never allow them that complexity? Margaret had sat by her desk, the ink still drying on his words, her heart beating too quickly. She had written back before dawn. Mr. Pierce. Women are perhaps even more contradictory than men. The difference is that history rarely bothers to record it. She had signed her note simply M. The exchange should have ended there. But it didn't. Night after night, letters passed between them, sometimes delivered by hand through aides too discreet to question, sometimes slipped under doors at events. The letters were not love notes, not at first. They were debates. Confessions. Sparks of wit that soon caught fire. A meeting in shadows. One evening in May, Margaret arrived at a townhouse on Q Street, an unremarkable brick home Daniel had borrowed from a friend. She wore a simple trench coat, her hair tucked beneath a scarf. Her driver had not asked questions, though she saw the suspicion in his eyes. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Daniel greeted her at the door, his sleeves rolled up, a pen still tucked behind his ear. You came, he said, his voice betraying surprise. You invited me, she answered. They laughed then, awkwardly at first, before settling into conversation that spilled from politics to poetry to the ache of solitude that bound them both. You know what they call you, Daniel said at one point, leaning back in his chair. What's that? The nation's widow. As if you belong to everyone and no one at once. Her throat tightened. No one had ever said it so plainly. And you? She asked. What do they call you? A troublemaker. A cynic. The man who writes what shouldn't be written. Their eyes held each other's across the dim room. It was the first moment Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. The first touch. It happened not with passion, but with simplicity. She reached for his hand as he spoke of his father's death, the years of struggle in Pittsburgh, the nights his mother cried over unpaid bills. Margaret's fingers brushed his, lingering just a fraction longer than they should have. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and charged. When Daniel turned his palm upward, enclosing hers, it was not the gesture of a journalist or a widow. It was the gesture of two souls who had been lonely for too long. The secret world. From then on, their meetings grew bolder. A walk through Dumbarton Oaks Gardens at twilight. A private corner of a museum where they pretended to study paintings while their shoulders brushed. At night, she would replay their words in her mind, a secret dialogue no one else could claim. He made her feel like Margaret again, not a symbol, not a relic, not the shadow of a dead man's greatness. Daniel, too, found himself changed. He had spent his career tearing down facades, exposing lies. But with Margaret, he wanted to protect the fragility he saw beneath her grace. He told himself it was foolish, impossible, doomed. And still he returned to her, again and again. The warning. One evening, as they lingered in the townhouse, Margaret whispered the fear that had begun to gnaw at her. If the world discovers this. They won't, Daniel interrupted gently. She shook her head. They always discover. They always judge. They'll say I've betrayed Charles. Betrayed the country. Daniel leaned closer. And what do you say? Her breath trembled. I say I'm tired of being a monument. I want to be a woman. His hand cupped her cheek then, and for the first time, their lips met, not with hunger, but with release. A kiss that carried months of unspoken words. The point of no return. When Margaret returned home that night, the city lights blurred through her car window. Her driver said nothing, though she could feel his questions unspoken. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still warm from Daniel's kiss, and knew the truth with a clarity that frightened her. There was no going back. The president's widow had stepped out of her shadows. And the world would never forgive her for it. Passion, once awakened, is not easily contained. For weeks, Margaret and Daniel had lingered on the edges of something greater, balancing between restraint and desire. But restraint can only hold for so long. And when it finally broke, it was with a force that neither of them could deny. The townhouse nights. The borrowed townhouse on Q Street became their sanctuary. Hidden behind its brick facade and shaded windows, Margaret found a world that belonged only to her and Daniel. Inside, she was not the president's widow. She was Margaret, a woman with laughter in her chest, warmth in her hands, and hunger in her veins. It began simply, a kiss deepening into an embrace into whispered confessions against his shoulder. But soon the barriers between them crumbled completely. They made love with the urgency of two people who had been starved of tenderness for too long. For Margaret, it was a rediscovery of her body, her desire, her capacity to feel alive. For Daniel, it was both triumph and surrender, the journalist who had once dissected her husband's legacy now bound to his widow with an intimacy no article could ever capture. In those nights, passion blurred into tenderness. He traced the lines of her face as if memorizing them. She whispered stories from her girlhood, things no one else knew. Together, they created a fragile cocoon, a universe where age, power, and politics did not exist. The illusion of safety. But outside those walls, reality loomed. Margaret still appeared at public events, her every smile photographed, her every word dissected. Daniel still published sharp articles, his reputation as a relentless critic growing. To the world, they were adversaries. To each other, they were sanctuary. And yet, the illusion of safety was brittle. Each time Margaret left the townhouse, she felt the air tighten. Did her driver suspect? Did her staff notice? The nation adored her as a grieving widow. What would they say if they saw her stepping into the arms of a younger man, a man who had once torn her husband apart in print? The thought should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, it thrilled her. For the first time in years, she was living, not merely existing. Conversations between sheets. They did not just share bodies, they shared secrets. Late at night, wrapped in tangled sheets, they spoke of things they could not tell the world. I sometimes wonder, Margaret confessed softly, if Charles ever really knew me. Or if I was just part of the stage set of his presidency. Daniel brushed his lips against her hand. He may have had the country, but he never had you, not the way I do. The words both soothed and frightened her. She wanted to believe them, needed to. Yet deep down, a voice whispered that nothing in her life could ever be simple again. The first risk. Their secrecy began to fray one evening when Margaret's driver, an old family loyalist, lingered too long outside the townhouse. When she emerged, her hair slightly mussed, her cheeks flushed, his eyes flicked to hers with quiet disapproval. He said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. That night, Margaret lay awake beside Daniel, her heart pounding. It's only a matter of time, she whispered. Then let time come, Daniel said firmly, pulling her close. We'll face it. But Margaret knew better. The world was not kind to widows who dared to love again, least of all when that love was scandalous. The thrill and the fear. Each meeting grew more reckless. A touch too long at a public event. A note slipped into her handbag by his hand. A night where she stayed later than she should have, returning home at dawn. The thrill burned in her veins, but so did the fear. She felt as if she were dancing on a tightrope, exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. Sometimes, when Daniel held her, she let herself imagine a future where they could walk openly together. A future where she was no longer bound to her husband's ghost, where she could be simply Margaret and he, simply Daniel. But in the morning light, reality always returned. She was not just a woman. She was the president's widow. And her choices carried the weight of a nation's judgment. The moment of realization. One evening, as rain pattered against the townhouse windows, Margaret stood by the fire while Daniel poured wine. She turned to him, her voice low but certain. "This us, it cannot last." Daniel froze, the glass in his hand. "Because of what people will say? Because of who I am. Because of who you are. We're building something beautiful on quicksand." He crossed the room in 2 strides, setting the glass aside. "Then let it sink. I don't care about the world, Margaret. I care about you." His words broke through her defenses. She let him kiss her, let the fire crackle as they surrendered to each other again. But even as passion consumed her, a small part of her heart whispered the truth. Danger had found them. And it was only a matter of time before the world did too.